Ladies and gentlemen, dames en heren, mesdames et messieurs, dear A+ friends, good evening. A+ and Beaux-Arts have the pleasure to welcome you tonight for this lecture. It's dedicated to the work of Bijoy Jain and his studio Mumbai that are on show currently at Maniera's Gallery until the 21st of May. Bijoy Jain worked in the United States and in London before returning to India in 1995. In 2005, he founded Studio Mumbai, a studio made up of architects and engineers, but also of carpenters and masons who have all been trained in traditional building techniques. In a metropolis like Mumbai, Bijoy Jain has developed an atypical attitude to the project. His work is slow, inclusive, and pays enormous attention to detail, using scale models rather than plans, within a firm or on-site, in a collective, rather than as a project manager. In the framework of the last issue of A+, titled Rethink Preservation, the brand new issue, Bijoy Jain accepted our invitation. Indeed, his office has developed several highly refined projects, giving this question a singular echo. Studio Mumbai works in a context of widespread destruction, rapidly built, and poor quality constructions. In their work, preservation does not apply only to building, but to a whole culture of architecture and construction tradition. Before letting our guest present his works and thoughts, I would like to thank A+ and Beaux-Arts teams, Amaryllis Jacobs, and our supports, FIBELSEM, the Brussels Capital Region, the Vlaamse Overheid, la Région Wallonie-Bruxelles, Stad Brussel, Velux, and of course, our A+ friends. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Cécile. Thank you all for taking the time. I'd like to thank A+ and Beaux-Arts and my hosts here, Amaryllis and Quentin, for their generosity and for this invitation to come and produce a series of pieces of furniture for them. What I'm going to present today is more, how would I say, a manner or a way of doing things. So anyway, very quickly I'm going to read, this is something that I've been very interested in. It's something that has evolved over a period of time. But very simply, a body of traditions, the idea of lore, and it's not like folklore, but this very precise word lore, a body of traditions and knowledge on a subject or held by a particular group, typically passed from person to person by word of mouth. The second one I particularly like, which is the space between the eye and the base of the bill of a bird, or between the eye and nostril of a snake. For me, this is very particular because this idea of sense and the idea of the things that we do, why do we do the things that we do, or how do we navigate ourselves in an environment? So this aspect of making space or making architecture for me is something that sort of engages the idea of the five senses. But more importantly, there's another one that, that's described with this idea of perception, this idea of an intuitive way to sort of move through and navigate through space. So that's really the subject of the discussion or the discourse that I'm interested in, that the studio's interested in. And a lot of the communication fundamentally happens through gestures, through the movement of the body, through linguistic instructions. So there's no particularly fixed framework of how communication occurs. And I'll talk about that more as we go along in today's presentation. This slide I like, and I want to sort of establish this idea of foundation with this idea that civilization is built on an aqueous footing. Very important, the word aqueous, because that's what actually creates a certain sense of instability, but I like the idea of more unpredictability, this sense of movement, the sense of an ebb and flow, this idea of tide, the idea of water. And when you think about, civilization across the globe, across the time that we have, been on this planet, it's very important, the relationship to water. So that's, for me, this very particular slide. It was taken in Rajasthan. It was an old, beautiful quarry that is still being excavated, and in odd condition, there was this moment of a large, heavy downfall of rain, and this moment where it sort of captured this whole sort of terrain, which then slowly over time is revealed. But these beautiful pavilions that are built, which were more like places to rest, because in a quarry, in a stone quarry, there are no trees. So just this sort of fragment of an idea. These pictures were taken again just out of curiosity. But so I'd like to sort of begin with this idea of an aqueous footing, something that's in constant flux, that's something that's in constant motion. And how do we negotiate this? Because also the way we conceive things, it's not a fixed point. From the time that you conceive to the time that something is built, there are a lot of influences or forces that actually come together to shift it, to change it. And how do we remain receptive to these moments that we have to actually change, this idea of agility? This slide I like, and this is taken in the south of India, but the reason I show it is this idea of not knowing which one came first. Again, I'm using India more as a background to describe certain phenomena that, in my view, are sort of prevalent universally around the globe. You see this in Belgium, you can see this in America, or you can experience them. But importantly, India is going through a rapid economic change. And this particular image on the left is actually, the ramp has come in because there's a motorcycle that now is a prize sort of piece of furniture, which every day in the evening it's brought into the center of the living room of the house. But what I like about this particular image is you don't quite know which one came first, the stairs or the ramp. So this idea of these sort of two parallel, I don't want to call it economies, but two parallel movements of culture, one that is going through a rapid economic progress. And of course, with India being a very old country, this sort of sense of time, of evolution, that has allowed things to be adjusted, to be measured, to be modified. But the ability for both of them to come together in a sort of seamless way, for me, is what is of actually particular interest. And so a lot of the work that I'm interested in is not so much the collision of the two, but the moments where these two can actually come together or coexist for a very particular period of time. It's not necessary that it's embalmed, for posterity. So this aspect of change, this aspect of evolution, for me is very important. That slide, the image on the left is a picture taken in Hampi. It was taken several years ago, more from just this idea of a very beautiful object, this rock. And much later I found out these little holes that were made. So there's a whole city, 15th century, that's just been constructed in granite, just in one material, stone. The beams, columns, slabs, everything, aqueducts, everything is in just this one material. And in a sense, this landscape of rocks is formalized in these very beautiful sort of granite buildings. But what is interesting for me is this idea of economy, and the idea of economy of energy. And what's interesting is that wooden pegs, I found this out much later in the way that they quarried the stone. Wooden pegs are driven into these holes, water is put, the wood expands and then splits the rock. Very simple device. And just through this very simple gesture, an entire civilization has been conceived. So the idea also of, the potential of our imagination in some ways to negotiate gravity. And I think that's what architecture is fundamentally confronted with, is this idea of gravity, this idea of weight. And for me, this idea of gravity, it's the singular, true egalitarian force that is applied to all of us. And for me, the question that comes forth is our ability to negotiate. And for me, what's important to negotiate this is more the idea of imagination, the ability to imagine as a responsive force to this idea of gravity. Again, I like this particular slide. It's of particular interest to me. These were sort of pitchforks, agrarian tools. I live in a country, 1 billion, 200 million people. 50% of the population still, I would say, and this is a pessimistic sort of number, is still Agrarian. Of course, that's slowly changing or rapidly changing. I I stopped to pick up these pitchforks just as objects that interest me, just in terms of a very precise device or a very precise tool, which is, an exact extension, or it sort of in some way is an extension of the hand itself. Even the way that you see the sort of leather binding along the, right there, and the sutures that are used to bind it, not that different from the palm of our hand. But importantly, that's not the reason. And so anyway, I was, buying these from these gentlemen here, and, I happened to be picking it up from this gentleman here, and I asked him, how come you're the only one dressed in a yellow T-shirt? So he kind of looks up at me and says, I get it for free. Of course, this is Rajasthan. It's a sort of desert climate, quite hot. A cotton T-shirt makes sense. Getting it for free, why not? And that's sort of his colleagues or his friends or relatives who have this sort of very classical cotton linen shirt that they would normally wear. And if you notice the pants, they're not really pants, they're just a cloth that's wrapped around. So anyway, as I was exchanging money with this gentleman, I see him sort of reach into his T-shirt, and I looked at him and says, wow, how did you do this? So he kind of looks back at me with this very beautiful smile. He says, I took it home, my wife cut it up. It's kind of like a Lucio Fontana cut, and this very beautiful pink satin pocket. Now, the reason I'm showing this for me is this idea of prejudice, or a lack of one, a lack of prejudice. And in this particular case, when you think about it, there's a whole agrarian landscape, there's a juggernaut economic boom that's taking place, and the ability to kind of negotiate what might seem, because these T-shirts are actually advertising, like Coca-Cola or some glue company or some construction company that is sort of giving these T-shirts out to promote them. But the ability to negotiate where what seemingly seems as a closed space, and that moment where it's not in some ways a necessity, but also this idea of the freedom to enter into a space that seemingly seems closed. So for me, that's really what I'm trying to show here, is this idea of a lack of prejudice, of not making a judgment of what is good or bad, or what is right or wrong. And I think that's where the potential of our imagination actually comes into play. Another thing that what I'm sort of very curious and interested in, and this sort of particularly happens in my country a lot, I'm sure it may happen in a sort of a different gestural way, but this idea of a yes and no is exactly the same. When you ask a question, you get this sort of, this kind of movement of the head, and then you ask, are you saying yes? And you get that back again. And so it kind of depends on the kind of movement or the sort of slowness or the quickness of this sort of gesture that determines whether it's a yes and a no. But more importantly, it's not about a yes or a no, but more actually what lies in between, the manner in which it's said, that for me is of interest, because a lot of other things are actually communicated. So the idea of communication becomes very important, especially with what we do. And this is something that I discovered going back to India, that, I came back from the US and you're trained to make drawings, and I did that for a project for several months. And what I found out was this drawing set just sat on a table and just collected dust. No one actually even picked it up and looked at it. And everything, the whole project had to be done, in a linguistic way, through gestures, through a drawing, through a sketch. But they always somehow seem to have a better way. And when I say a better way, it was a way that actually was something that allowed them to maintain their center of gravity. So in that sense, the energy is really kept sort of very intact and taut. So all the details, for me, in some way, sort of emerged from their idea of how they were able to contain their emotional and physical energy in the act of making something. So that's something that, of course, is what I discovered along the way, this idea. And very quickly I had to give up, making drawings. But or at least drawings in the way that we make drawings. It's not that I'm nostalgic about, traditional methods or craftsmanship. For me, the idea of a craftsman is one that remains relevant to his or her time, more in their ability to take a certain set of skills and apply those, not necessarily a woodmaker could apply that to some other set of conditions. And the ability to transfer or move from one to the other, for me, is actually what is more important. And for me, that's the idea of this idea of a craftsman. This image I call postures in architecture. This was something that sort of unfolded when we were in Venice in 2010. And we had to do this black screeded floor, and there was 6 or 7 of carpenters that were there, myself, and a young American student intern who was there with me. And then, of course, we were given to meet the local contractors, and they came back with a can of paint, and we said, no, this is not what we're looking for. So we kind of thought about it a little bit. And said, okay, maybe we can do it, because we watched the masons working, and what it required was basically, the gesture was that you had to kind of squat on the ground. So it meant that you had to sit down and work for a couple of hours that way. Of course, I couldn't get down for more than 30 seconds. Sam, who was there, the American, barely even made it to the floor. But the carpenters, because of their ability to work, and if you notice, all 4, feet and hands, there's this idea of the posture that where everything is connected. There was a certain sense of balance and endurance, I think, also, and restraint. And their ability to sort of make that came from more the posture of the body. Not just a physical one, but more a visceral one for me that is of particular interest, the kind of manner that is brought to that particular subject. So that's why it sort of then got me thinking this idea of, that methods of making or materials might exist, but what if postures that we take, in some way are obscured, or we change, or those evolve, that maybe through that idea, that this idea of making is obscured. In my view, nothing is lost. It's only obscured for a period of time. So that's again this idea of this recuperation. It's more in the idea of posture, and our ability to recuperate comes from that sort of idea of the posture we take. For me, what's of interest is the space that lies here in between. It's that space again. And again, for me, it's not because it's by hand. It can be a machine. Those big, huge JCBs. That sort of dig the ground. And it's what I think happens with a machine is that the distance and the time is more condensed. The distance is greater, and the ability to sort of react is much quicker. And I think somewhere that displacement, that our inability, I think, more to negotiate that speed and distance is what I think is what we, at least for me, is something that one tries to negotiate. It's the same thing here again. It's this idea of affinity, this idea of affection that you kind of sense or you see here. So I just sort of was raising the question that what if, we lose postures that we take, and, maybe that's how the architecture in some way is a result of that. Now I'm going to show you a series of projects, and lately I've been more interested in this idea of linguistic instructions, of this ability to sort of maybe give 4 instructions and then just walk away. Length, breadth, height, and structure, and this idea of, very immediate marks that are made. And in some way, there's a communication that takes place. Again, this idea of communication for me is very important, where the moment I'm communicating, very much in the way that I'm doing right now, that the moment I do that, it already is evolving and changing by the time it's received and then passed back on. So there's a sort of transmission delay, but also transmission error that is taking place. For me, it's more this idea of that displacement, that error, or not so much of understanding, but of receiving. And again, it's all based on this idea of perception, something that is more received from the belly button, for me, which is very important. So anyway, I'm going to show you a series of projects. This is a project that we are working on right now. It's a project for a house that I've been sort of inquiring about, where the sort of foundations in some way have always been there. But how do you make something which is fictitious in some way, not to bring authenticity to it, but to bring a certain perceptive quality to it, where it's perceived in a way that is familiar and unfamiliar both at the same time. So anyway, let me play this. What's interesting is that this particular method has been existing.
They made the
So there are only three tools: the chisel, a hammer, and a sort of like a crowbar just to lift that up. But what's interesting is that it's through the idea of sound, right, that they're able to sort of gauge or negotiate these sort of fissures in the ground. So they literally tap the ground, and what you saw as a quarry, a stone quarry, which has been excavated now for about 60 years, is just these three tools. And till date, it still exists. So this was just taken a few months ago. It's interesting because I showed you the slide earlier of the rock and those holes that were made. It's exactly a similar technique. So this idea that we still have these kinds of processes of making it, for me it was kind of, I was very curious because suddenly, I came across a method that sort of dates back, and I want to be optimistic or rather pessimistic here with saying that it's about 1,000 years old. It could possibly go much later or much older than that. But just to give it a sort of sense of, a point of time. And of course, the stone that you see is, something that gravity has acted on, that has evolved. And this idea of just being able to make these marks through linguistic gestures, or even through just gestures that are made through a line, like a blue line that is chalked on the floor, and the immediacy of it. These holes are cut. You see these sort of holes, and they make these cuts not necessarily perfectly rectangular. And of course, it's defined by the sound that they are able to locate, the sort of airspace that's in the ground. And they make these holes, and then they immediately sort of make these really tiny sort of gestures, and then the rock just pops out. Poop, it just comes out. So for me, it was very fascinating. We were talking about gravity and center of gravity, this idea of just these four gestures, and before you know, you just have something that comes up. It's like Schindler did this, what is called like a tilt-up house. But this idea of this whole thing just coming up to what I'm calling this the first sort of ideas of architecture. So this is a pavilion that we just presented in Milan. It's a show that's ongoing right now. And the whole basis of the stability or the structural stability is based on this idea of gravity. The more stones you put on the top, the more stable it gets. The further away, the more you take away, the more delicate or the more fragile it is. So this is just, again, those four sets of instructions, length, breadth, height, and structure, that have enabled this sort of idea of the sort of origins of architecture, which in my view still exist. Again, it's not so much to return back, but more to give another possibility in the time that we are in. So that's, again, this is all very slender, the columns, and we were trying to find out the sort of most optimum or the most minimum sort of measures that would still enable this idea of a stability of a structure. It was quite interesting because it was just done very recently in Milan. We had some engineers come and look at it, and they were absolutely not okay with it, as you can imagine. But of course, they did the stability tests and said that even if it passes the tests, the structure's too rudimentary and we won't allow it to be done. So eventually they've put some plates and some points. And for me, that's not important anymore, because what's captured in this is the possibility for it to now evolve. It's sort of been taken and distilled into its, I wouldn't say its purest form, but from that point of its conception and from the point of it being present, how it takes shape as time passes by, I think for me is of a greater curiosity. All the different overlays that come in, much like to the chagrin of the engineer. So it's still, it's already been modified in a very brief period of time. And for me, it's interesting. Or even if it was pulled away or dismantled, the core idea of the space still exists or is embedded in these rocks or in these stones. Again, for me, this idea of the hand comes more from the idea of, the hands were the first, I would say, the first way that we were able to communicate. The first gestures we made to communicate were just through the gestures of the hand. So our sort of DNA coding goes that far back. And I'm always very curious, not so much, as time goes by, that if our hands had to go away, what would be the other means that we would develop within ourselves to communicate? So the possibility of having both or having one and not the other is something for me which is of this idea of a sway, this idea of resonance of time, and what we keep or what we allow to go away. So anyway, these are very quick images of that particular project. This is a house, the beginning of a project, and there was this hole in the ground. It's a project that's not too far from the city of Mumbai. It's about a half an hour or a 40-minute boat ride and then an hour's drive to the southern coast. It's about 20 odd, maybe 20, 25 meters from the sea line. But what was interesting was we found this excavation, and within this excavation was actually sweet water. Now, for me, this idea of water, because when you think about it, at least back at home in India, the built landscape, more than 50% of the built landscape is actually outside the realm of what I do or what most of you do, or the idea of the practice of an architect. It is self-reliant, self-built, there's an intuitive knowledge, and it's been something that has always fascinated me, that there's a whole landscape that one quite is curious about, and the way that it has been conceived. So very much in a similar way, in a population of 1.2 billion people, at least 500 million people go to a source of water. Water doesn't come to them. You don't turn a tap on and the water comes to them. So there's a sense of ritual, a sense of knowing, a sense of familiarity, and a sense of also this idea of an immediate environment that they're engaged in. So this idea of a ritual of actually going to water, collecting water for one's own nourishment, for one's own livelihood, for me, sort of plays a very important role. So we decided in some way to keep this source because there's no piped water that comes to this place. You're sort of reliant on the source, the resources that are available in your immediate environment. So it's a hole in the ground, there's sweet water, and that sweet water sits on the saline water, which is a lot heavier. So it sort of has this sort of moment, this threshold or a diaphragm. And I'm sort of here, I'm showing this particular picture because he's sort of our engineer, if you want to call it. He's a master well builder. That was the core of the project. That was the inception of the project. And so this is sort of initial discussions, and here he's communicating this sort of very small fissure that was there. And this idea of weight, if we built over it, that over a period of time, this small sort of, kind of crack in the ground, which allowed the water, over a period of time, if we built it with stone, would slowly close that gap. And what you would find is then you would get saline water instead of the sweet water. So anyway, these are the sort of references or the people that I have engaged with. And it's quite interesting to sort of have this idea of science and this idea of something that is more visceral, something that's more tacit, and the idea of combining these two aspects, one that comes from a sense of, divinity, like water divining. So there's a sensibility that sort of evolves over a period of time through the things that are made, through the experiences that they have. And of course, that's the local community that's come together. It's a private house, but how they come together in this sort of core idea of making this very sort of, aspect of the belly button, this sort of belly that in some way contains, the nourishment for this particular project. This drawing was, of course, made much after the project. That's that space. These holes that you see allow water, light, and air. So there's no glass or anything like that. This was taken in the monsoon. And on a full moon, high tide, and a lot of rain, basically the water goes up to the slab. But it's only for 4 hours because that's when the tide starts going back in, or rather going back out. The water slowly starts receding. Again, this idea of ebb and flow is something very important or very interesting that one has to negotiate, at least in the place that I work in, because we work with two aspects of time. There's one that is lunar time, which is really based on it's based on the flow of water. It's the fluctuation of water, because as the moon is waxing, the tide is much stronger. The pull of the tide is much stronger, and as it is waning, the tide underneath is a lot more gentler. So there's it's in some way, when you think about it, our bodies are fundamentally made up of water. We all know that. So of course there's some kind of connection there that's happening. Simultaneously with that, and it's a very recent phenomena that we all face culturally, this idea of Greenwich Mean Time, the idea of time in the way that we all know it today. In India, we have both these aspects of time, so we have a lot of holidays too. It's quite interesting. And come the monsoon, you can do anything. You can pay the workers as much money as you would like to, but they all move back to their towns, to their villages, to farm. But this idea of this whole aspect of a culture that kind of moves to the rhythm of the moon, and that's something that's where we all have sort of in some way come from. So again, it's not so much to retain one and let go the other, but the idea that is there a capacity that we can, in some way allow them to come together in an understanding of each other, rather than in the diversity that it provides, rather than in the separation. Because I think for me, there's more possibility in that. The next slide that I'm showing you is actually taken in the summertime. And this was something that sort of struck me, this idea of an interiority and exteriority. This space is not too far from the sea. And you can see this sort of registration of this line here. That was the high tide a few hours ago. This picture was taken when we got there, and it was interesting to sort of see this very precise registration of a tide line. What was interesting for me was that the presence of the outside was much stronger inside this volume, inside this room, that in some way was like a breathing, it was a mechanism that was breathing. But the idea of interiority and exteriority in some way was displaced. The sense of the water, the sense of the sea was much stronger inside, with the eyes actually taken away, without the view. So it was this aspect of sound, the aspect of resonance that was there. And it was sort of a discovery that, it's not necessary that this idea of a physicality of a view that sort of is what creates an aspect of the idea of interiority or exteriority. I think the fact that both can collectively exist both at the same time. So that was something for me, quite a discovery. That's the gesture of the plan. It's sort of more this kind of gesture which protects the belly button, or this idea of these holes that you see there. And everything in some way is feeding back. In the monsoons, the roof and every aspect of the house sort of regenerates or recharges this aquifer that you see below. Again, for me, this idea of imprint is very important. This idea of something that not so much to leave behind, but this idea that there's an impregnation, the capacity that we all have, this idea of impregnation, and the ability for that to be picked up with a civilization that we don't know yet, this idea of something that's being formed, and we don't know yet what that form will be, but to leave something there in the ground for another civilization to pick up. So for me, the idea that this house, of course, in some time, slowly will disintegrate or go back into the ground, but what remains is this core space, with the idea that it can be picked up by another civilization in some point of time. So this idea of leaving something behind to nourish another. This next slide, and I find this quite interesting. These are actually forest tribals. They were forest dwellers at some point and now have been displaced since the 1970s when they all had to leave the forest. Their entire dependency was on the forest. But in the monsoons, they basically still make these sort of crafts. These are small like vessels that they put out into the streams. And of course, originally this was done with hide, which they hunted down in the forest. But their ability to negotiate even in their displacement, so they now primarily work just before the rains on construction sites, on roadworks. And so what you see, these cement bags are actually used for the lining, and then they use the tar that they're using to make the roads as a waterproofing. And this still allows them culturally to go and fish, because their entire dependency in some way was not based on economy that you and I know about. It was based on more an empathy towards the environment that they lived in, their ability to be very precise of what they took or what they left behind, and those moments that allowed them to sort of coexist with the sort of larger environment. But anyway, for me it was kind of interesting, for them to sort of to observe these things and their ability to sort of somehow transfer it in things that one does. So this is a project, again, this is, boats that are built in a very similar way. It's watertight, can be replenished. If there's a hole, you can fix it quite easily, so it's quite self-reliant. And all of these things are kind of embedded in these kinds of materials. So that's a project. It's for a multi-generation family. There are 3 families that sort of come together and live in this house. And there are these 9 square boxes made out of bricks, very simple. The foundations barely go like a meter into the ground, quite light in its manner or in its posture. And then they're all connected by these roofs that sort of connect these various boxes. And that's sort of, again, a sort of more detailed plan. That's the 4. So the foundations are just over these, very simple, easy to do. The dimensions are given, and quite quickly everybody understands the sort of nature of the ground, and they're able to build it quite simply. So that's the image of the roof. It's tar. It's a black tar that is used as waterproofing. It's sheets of plywood, which are then coated with this material. So there's a sort of ease of means that goes in. Again, what was important was in this particular project, and something that I've been more preoccupied with, not so much that I'm averse to concrete or steel or anything like that, but this idea of just the resources that are available. There's an immediacy, and these bricks are actually thrown away. What you see as these peripheral bricks, these are brick kilns, and these bricks are normally thrown away because they're black. And so, when the bricks are sold, they're more interested in the bricks looking more even. So it's quite interesting. You can get this for 1/10 of the price. Of course, by the time we got to 2 trucks, the prices started going up. But that's another thing. What's interesting also about these bricks is that they're the best fired bricks. They're the hardest. They've been fired for a longer period of time. And it was interesting that we started going to different, kiln brick makers to collect this. And it's normally done just before the rains, because that's when they stop making bricks, because it's all outdoors. So there are no factories really. Of course, there are bigger factories, but this is a larger part of the population. I was just talking to someone a little earlier, this sort of activity that takes place pre-monsoon, before they set their fields for farming. They take the same clay and make their bricks. And in some way, there's a whole economy that's based on their engagement with the land, with the water, that sort of creates a pattern. You could call it an architectural pattern that kind of emerges from this kind of engagement. So anyway, these are the walls. It's built in a very particular way. It's called a rat trap bond, as in rat, as in the rat. And it was actually developed by a British engineer, a gentleman named Laurie Baker, who came to India after the war and settled there. And his whole objective was to actually build very simply and somehow make this idea of the brick lighter, more accessible, and to provide sort of single units to a larger population that was unable to afford, good housing. So it's a very sort of interesting method. It's a hollow cavity where 2 bricks, which would normally be this way, are then placed like that. So you automatically get an air gap, and you get this sort of very beautiful interlocking. And so with less bricks, you still have the same strength and structure. That's just an image of the roof. Again, what you see here, basically, there's no foundation. It's just compacted earth. This is a point load, because most of that roof is actually pulled back to the 9 boxes, so all the weight is taken back. This is more to sort of just take care of the end where it doesn't fall down. So it's a very simple point load and a sort of shallow wall that's built to sort of accept this kind of structure. This is something that, as time goes by, very quickly in the case of, and I'm saying this more in terms of an evolutionary sense, because of the sort of rapid change in the economy. For example, wood that we would work with maybe not so long ago, 7, 8 years ago, so if it was, let's say, 10 euros, now it's tenfold. So just the material in itself is in some ways more difficult to buy, and also in some ways difficult to come across as there's more and more development. But this idea that occurred to me that 500 million people, most of the built landscape is outside the framework of architecture. So I'm saying that if you take 500 million people and out of that you cut away 400, you still have 100 million people, you still take away another 50. So you still have about 50 million bricklayers at your disposal. Good or bad is another thing. So this idea of sort of this ability to regenerate, this ability to be self-reliant. So I was sort of got fascinated with this idea of brick making. And the best thing we could do was to sort of to develop an intimacy of what this thing is about. We started making, instead of drawings, we started actually making these brick kilns. These are like little tiny bricks that are actually made in the studio, and the kiln is actually fired in the studio. You could pretty much do it on your desk if you don't put your desk on fire, but that's... so this is just a series of cross sections that we were looking at, in the way that you set up a kiln. Again, just out of interest, nothing more than that. It was just to explore this kind of world of bricks directly within the capacity of the studio. And so that takes me to a project. This is in Ahmedabad, again, a multi-generation family. It's very different, I think, culturally back at home, where the families also kind of live together. In some ways, I think the closest would be maybe the Italians that are still very closely knit. But in this case, it was quite a beautiful sight, and they had 50 wild peacocks. There are no pictures of the peacocks, but maybe you can imagine them. And for me, it was important because the moment we would start construction, this idea for me that these 50 peacocks who have been inhabitants of this land would maybe necessarily, I wasn't sure, but might be displaced. And that became the sort of motivation. Again, what motivates oneself to take a particular route, for me, is important. That moment where you decide, I'm going to follow this path. And for me, in this case, it was more about negotiating these peacocks. But anyway, so what was interesting was the earth that was excavated from the foundations was actually made back into these brick compressed earth blocks. They were more like plates, 50 centimeters high. I don't know the length and breadth anymore, but X and Y. And you can see, so the whole house in some way sort of emerges out of the ground. The reason I'm sharing this with you is because no trucks left and no trucks came in. We had no movement of trucks. It was just humans, people. The material was immediate. A special sort of compressed machine was made that was brought to site. These bricks were made. They were sun-dried. And the same thing was then put back as the foundations, and the building sort of emerges. Again, for me, it's a hot climate. It made sense. We have enough bricklayers, so it could be done with a particular kind of speed. And again, more than the brick itself, for me, it was the mortar joint, the joint that connects the bricks, because we had about maybe 20 or 30 bricklayers. At some point there were 40. But if you can imagine in a sort of field of 40 different bricklayers, there's always a skill, a varying skill. So the idea of the mortar was in some way to contain the sort of total bandwidth of one that was highly skilled and that one that was not so skilled, and the ability for them to actually connect together. There was a speed at which they could come together. And of course, by the time the project was finished, they were pretty much on the same plane. So the idea of the mortar became more important than the brick itself. This is all built again in lime, mud, of course, or the sand from the ground. In this particular case, there's got it has a sort of strange concrete frame that in some way kind of makes a framework for the rest of the infill to occur. So there are these three kind of boxes or these three houses that are connected by a large courtyard in between, which becomes the gathering space. Again, here the idea was that the first 50 centimeters is sacrificial. And I use the word sacrificial because over a period of time, and for me, I measure a building with the advent of every monsoon. The rains in some way have the ability to sort of in some way slowly push this building in its right place. It sort of develops its own sense of center of gravity. But of course, through a period of time, there would be erosion on the surface. And as the project erodes, there's a point where it actually becomes a protection because you start getting these kind of like radiator fins, which then prevent the water from really penetrating deep into the thickness of the wall. So the first 50 centimeters are actually been developed in a way that you sacrifice that over a period of time. And it's quite nice, this particular space, that's an interior space before you lead on to another room, and it actually rains when there's the monsoon, it kind of rains through this hole. So in some way, this idea of a sort of an opening that actually allows this idea of water to in some way enter into you, both metaphorically and physically both. And it's quite interesting because you can circumambulate through this sort of very precise square that's been drawn in the ceiling, where that's where the water is contained. So anyway, these are sort of small things for me that are very particular, this idea of, how does one still inhabit a space where you have the possibility of water entering into that space. This is a project in Mumbai, a population of 22 million. This is, slowly a megapolis. It's what you see here is in the last maybe 10 years, 12 at best. So all of this is, happening at a rapid pace. This is a project. It was an old warehouse, a tobacco go-down, built in the late, I think it was 1896. It caught fire. And then this was sort of found, I found this particular piece of land, and I have my studio, my home, but also there are 6 other inhabitants that share their own space within this project. But importantly, this is the view, what it used to be, and you can see the adjacencies over a period of time. These inhabitants that you see here on the adjacencies. And this is Mumbai. If you took a cross-section of the map of Mumbai, or the one that you receive maybe when you're at the airport, is nowhere near spatially the map, what you actually experience. There's this whole other in-between space that's occupied, and and that's what allows 22 million people to co-inhabit this very dense metropolis. So these were the sort of the plan, the courtyards that you see. That actually came in because we were unable to take the roofs the way they used to be, which meant that we'd have to take the water outside, which would mean that the water would then drain onto the peripheries that have now been occupied. So the only way to take that water was to actually turn the roof back in. So we were taking the water back in. And what's quite interesting for me was this sort of landscape that you see, that because we have the zoo across this particular project, and there are these bats that fly every evening. And it was through the droppings of the bats that these sort of trees have come, have sort of emerged. So the idea that this project could in some way contain the capacity to contain all these different layers that are at work, in a very unseeming way. So these courtyards in some way become these openings to the sky, become the openings that allow an inhabitation. If we then at some point decide to leave or abandon, not abandon in an abandoning way, but as time evolves, that this might alter itself. But the idea that the project has the capacity to regenerate just by the few decisions that are made that allow all these different aspects or forces that are around it to participate. So that's the space. It's a sort of 14 foot, which would be about 5 meter wide, sort of loading dock space. Most of the windows and openings were kept, and that became the sort of game in some way, to make these divisions. Again, the idea was that to develop a typology that is egalitarian, that is universal to east, west, north, and south, but also to this idea of dimension, that if I have 1,000 square feet and someone else has 2,000 or 200 square meters and 100 square meters, the quality of what one experiences is similar, if not the same. And so this idea that it is independent of its physical boundaries of east, west, north, and south, and ground and sky. So for me, this was very important to develop a strategy that in some way was universal to location. That's in construction. Of course, now the trees have re-emerged. We had to, in some way, because the trees that you saw earlier were actually, being eaten, were actually growing on top of the concrete, quite fragile. So if there was a strong wind, it would come down. But this is sort of the beginning of the project. And these were the drawings that we had to make. This was actually a method that we developed in the studio, because what we discovered was in the monsoons with these big A1 drawings, by the end of the monsoons, you basically had shreds of paper in your hand. So the carpenters, in their sort of wily way, developed masking tape, and that's put on these very inexpensive sheets of plywood there. So you can start now making drawings at full scale that you can see right there. So it's masking tape. The moment you want to make a correction, you just cut out the part that you want to make a correction, put some more masking tape, and draw it back on. So in some way, they become tablets. And in some ways, they also become models, because it's sort of like an unfolded elevation. So you could very quickly take a drawing and make a model out of it, like a pop-up, very quickly. So these were sort of devices that were developed more from negotiating climate, more from negotiating environment, just in terms of how do we still retain all this means of communication as the project evolves. So they're called tape drawings, and we still make them now. And they're very fast, very efficient, very quick. And once you're done, you just peel away the masking tape and then reuse the plywood. Of course, with that, the drawings disappear. That's the space. That's the studio here. It's a 100-centimeter, a wall. The existing boundary walls of the warehouse were kept intact, just reinforced just enough. And the idea that you could, for me again, this idea of how do you displace program, that in some way that the program at some point becomes irrelevant. And I mean it not in a sort of irrelevant way, but that you sort of transcend the program, the ability that the space has the capacity to transform at a certain point in time, be it a school, a gallery, a workshop, a tobacco go down again. So the capacity for the architecture in some way to hold its center of gravity for me becomes very important in the projects that we make. This is a house that we're doing in Barcelona, but more recently I've become very fascinated with this idea of demolition, because there are all these highways being built, a lot of new towns, a lot of the old buildings are being torn down, and it's all done by hand again. There's this whole sort of, if you want to call it, method of breaking, where they're very precisely cut. They're able to discern the sort of weaknesses in a building. But this is a very beautiful sectional cut of a building. So this idea of what was an interior space now is made exterior. Sort of if you had to cut yourself halfway down the middle, and the idea of opening the sense of interiority to the exterior, for me is a sort of fascinating question. So this idea of, what is embedded in these sort of facades, or this idea of a new elevation that is now being exposed. So this is a project in Matarranya. It's a 2.5-hour drive from Barcelona. I'm going to be very quick with this one. This is Picasso spent some time here, not too far, about 6 kilometers from the building site, where he spent 2 months recuperating from an illness. And it's, it's somewhere there in that village that he spent 2 months, a very important 2 months of his time, and painted also at that point in time. But what's interesting is the person who's building this project, he's a 27-year-old young lad, but his entire family have been, in the building business. They were stone cutters. So I was just narrating to him this story of seeing these kinds of buildings and structures there. And he says, yeah, I remember these kind of stories that my great-grandfather would talk about, or his grandfather would talk about, which again then goes back to the idea of lore. Much in the way that if you've seen Tarkovsky's film Andrei Rublev, this idea of making of that bell, where they really don't know how to make, and that's pretty much, I would say, and you must excuse me here, that it's something about finding your way, but finding your way through more a sense of stories that you might have heard, things that you might have seen, and in some way to sort of connect them or to collect them in the anticipation of its possibility when it all comes together. But anyway, quickly, this is a house. It's a house that's been split in two. This was a house for me at a very important point in my life where, my house was in some way being split in two. So the idea was to actually create a space that allowed both of them to kind of coexist in that split. So what I'm showing you here is the body of water in some way that actually connects the two spaces. And for me, the house actually resides here, not here and here, but the space in between. That's the gesture, that's a quick sketch. That's a view from there to Picasso. So in the evening or nighttime, you're able to engage with Picasso, and in the daytime, you see these beautiful, rugged mountains, this amazing mountainous landscape. So this sort of conversation of the two houses, one that is engaged with the mountains and one that's engaged with Picasso at night, because the entire village sort of lights up, and this beautiful sort of idea of diamonds that you begin to see at night. This is, spaces or houses that have been left behind in the vicinity, in that region. Again, for me, it was not, to replicate these or in some way recuperate this kind of architecture, but more the kind of idea of ease of means, this idea of something being complete and incomplete both at the same time. So it's a very slow process of, making cuts, making a road, making a clearing, making a plinth, etc., that slowly develops in the formation of a project. So for me, what was important was this hole in the ground, which is a tube well, and the water percolates from it because someone has left the tap on or has not been attentive. That water trickles down, is collected, and that becomes a source. That becomes a source for life. And how horses can come for water, birds can come for water, humans can come in. So that really becomes the sort of center of the project. I'll just quickly run through these images. But the sense is really that at that point, and it was very interesting, this was some time ago, a very important architect at least in the region that I work in, and he came from Sri Lanka, a gentleman called Jeffrey Bawa, and I remember meeting him, and what I remember taking away from him, and I remember him saying this, there's too much architecture between me and the view, which I found quite interesting. So there's always a moment or a point in the projects that one does is where you somehow are still connected, but in some way you sort of leave it behind. You're exposed and yet contained. And for me, this is that body of water that actually allows that meeting point to occur. That's the plan, the two houses, that's the water, that's Picasso there, and that would be the rugged mountains. But what's interesting is so if I call that the living room, everything happens in this very open, exposed space. The climate is very conducive to being outdoors, so the rooms are more at a certain point to just go and recede in, much like a cave. It's a farm. It's this idea of an agrarian place where slowly one might grow lemon trees or orange trees, olive trees are already there. So in some sense, you start. There's there's vine trees out there. So this idea of cultivation, this idea of cultivating the land becomes very important in the manner in which we occupy it. Sorry, I'm going. This is the last project. It's a weavers' complex in the northern part of India, in the base of the Himalayas. I'm showing this because it was interesting, this idea of cultivation, of architecture for me. So it was interesting that while they were farming, we were also building at the same time. And with that, it required a kind of particular kind of care as you negotiated the land. I know it seems ridiculous, these guys throwing rocks, and you guys thinking they could do it a much smarter, sort of quicker way. But anyway, that's the way for the moment. So I'm showing you this because not so much about slowness or speed, But for me, the reason I show this is it was intentional because, on a construction site, we're in construction. But this idea of, constructing with a certain kind of elegance, I think, which is very important because with that automatically, this detail that we're talking, for me, that's the detail. And with that idea, if you hold that idea, that detail automatically emerges rather than going to the detail, it actually comes to you. So for me, that aspect or that attitude becomes very important in the making of architecture. This is the sort of gestural diagram. Again, you can see, that's the line out. These are actually my clients are in there. I've sort of positioned all of them to sort of understand the space that they're making. And it was quite nice because there's a sense of, and that then forms a discussion for the project, a little bit more, a little bit less, and there's sort of all this it's kind of like a bit of a dance. But anyway, the river Stones, this is very close to the Ganges. It's a very important part of the country. And I like this idea of what you saw, this sort of erosion or the flow of water in the monsoons and the kind of things that it sort of takes away, the erosion in some way, this kind of pattern emerges. And that became very important as this idea of the foundation. It's an excavation. In some way, it's an archaeological finding that through the rains going through the mountains, as it erodes the soil, these sort of stones slowly start emerging to give you some cues, to give you some clues about the attitude or the positions you would possibly want to take. So again, these are the strings, line outs, drawings made at full scale directly on site. But of course, all of this is also practiced well before going to the project. So a lot of the things that we do in the studio are more about practice. It's more about, it becomes part of a sort of idea of your consciousness. I don't mean it in a sort of, but more just like anything, when you practice a sport, it's just by doing it again and again and again, where it just becomes a very visceral part of you. So this idea of sort of making in the studio is more about an attitude that you take with you when you actually go into the act of making or doing that becomes important. So that's the project, that's the residences, this is the workshop, that's the entrance, that's the utilities building. And it's quite interesting because my client, she's Japanese, she's a weaver, and it's quite extreme because she's decided to make this a way of life where she farms. She was actually planting indigo in the earlier film that you saw, in the small footage that you saw. She's planting indigo, and then she harvests that indigo and then makes a dye on the day of no moon, I think, if I'm correct. So it's a kind of live, much like wine. It's sort of active and it's alive, and that becomes the resource. But all the trees, all the plants become the dyes. She also looks after, silkworms and makes the cocoons. And from that she draws the thread. So it's quite extreme, it's more like a way of life. It's not just textiles, it's not just weaving, but a very complex kind of weave that's actually occurring. And part of the brief of the project was that she wanted this project to in some way take into account materials from a very close proximity, manpower from a close proximity. That's the sort of gesture of the project. There's a courtyard there. The moon rises out there, so on a day of a full moon, you sort of see this idea of the moon rising. And again, it was to somehow catch the moon in this space. So for me, the whole intent here was really to catch that moment of a full moon inside that space, and in some way bringing the moon back down to the ground. And it became a sort of gathering space. So all the looms and all of that happens in this structure. So that's the workshop. And in some way, for me, it was important. So again, here it's built with stone, brick, lime, and mud. That's it. There's, again, not that there's no concrete. It's quite interesting also because I'm convinced we have a building called Fatehpur Sikri, not that far from the Taj Mahal, but for me, a very important project. And I keep saying that we have the capacity, and I think it's not just an India-centric thing, I think it's the capacity that we have globally, the capacity to in some way imagine, or at least allow ourselves to imagine, the possibility of building in these ways. So here, of course, this was a sort of, not an experiment, but more a test to see if something like this could be done. And of course, very, very naturally, and very easily people that are working on this site were quite easily able to adapt to this method of making. Those are the that's the foundations that are being cut. So again, cut and fill. In this case, again, no earth leaves or no earth comes in. It's all been displaced, in a way that is arranged around the land. So it's again that idea of the ramp and the stairs. It's just a matter of displacement and a balance of that displacement, because when you displace earth, you sort of change the status quo of the land. But in its rearrangement, in the onset of every monsoon, in the onset of every season, it slowly finds its sort of optimum balance. And for me, this becomes a very important way of setting a project in the ground. That's the reinforcement. It's bamboo that's then covered with bitumen. It's actually got silk thread that we tie. It's very strong. Silk thread was used for fishing, to make fishing nets, which I discovered, of course, through the making of this particular project. That's again the rat trap bond. This is a pavilion, which is actually the gallery to display her textiles that she makes. These are images during construction. We are nearly now finished with this project. I think in another month and a half they will be occupying it. This is a nomadic loom. Again, very simple resources that still allow them to make textiles. So very simply, just by our ability to sort of arrange things, that's our capacity from textile to food to architecture. I mean, it's vast. And for me, I'm really interested in this aspect where you somehow seemingly see nothing, but yet there is everything that you sort of find embedded in there. You can see these are the dyes, the indigo. This is the silk thread that comes from these very particular silk cocoons. It's a whole world, and quite interesting. The bricklayers that are on this particular site, they actually come from, I would say, 15 generations. I'm being, conservative here, that have actually spent, or their livelihood was actually cultivating silk cocoons, this very particular kind, and they would grow mulberry. So there's this whole story that kind of unfolds, this whole cross weave that is occurring. The bricklayers know how to make, pull a silk thread from a cocoon. If you just understand the dimensions of what the hand has to negotiate, sort of from one which is fragile and one which is quite strong and heavy, and their ability to be able to work with both those materials simultaneously, for me, is one of a sort of fascinating exercise. That's the washing area. Behind that room is the indigo room, very important room for her, where the indigo is kept. It's kept at 27 degrees. It has to be done exactly at 27 degrees. So it's kind of like a cellar, but it is quite humid and moist in there. This is, where they actually heat their different dyes and heat the water. So it's kind of also going into the ground in the building. These are all, again, stone, brick, it's mud and lime plaster. So and again, the color in some way comes from the land. The materials come from harvesting the land. It's quite interesting. The reason I'm using marble, this is a marble roof. It's if I tell you, it's less expensive than glass and MDF. It's crazy. So here we have the opportunity to use this kind of material. I would not have otherwise, and it's easily accessible. But yeah, this is a sort of marble roof that wraps the periphery of the building, but also the quality of light that actually comes through this space. That's the indigo room that I was talking about earlier. That's the room where they wash, they prepare the threads. So it's quite complex, the manner of this entire weaving complex. It's a very intimate and complex exercise of how the exchanges occur. For me, what's interesting is it's about maybe 3 acres of land, and the hand has actually touched the entire surface at some point, all 3 acres, very carefully in some form or the other. And for me, that's interesting. This is something that I also came across when I was in Denmark, and Cor Klint, his father, P.V. Jensen Klint, was building this church. And what he did was ask 9 bricklayers that every time they laid a brick, they took 2 bricks and they would scratch it, like rub the 2 bricks. And it was quite interesting. So you sort of see these scratch marks in the bricks, but each brick in that way is different. But it also catches more light because he's just increased the surface area because of making that scratch in the brick. And I just thought about it as a very curious exercise of the idea of the hand and how one can engage in the action of building.
મેં જોયું મને તો જોઈને ગઈ હતો પણ કોઈ બેઠેલું ના છે ને એટલે મેં મને થયું એક કઈ નાખી તમારી છે.
For me, this is a very important clip, and I share this with you. For me, it's sort of, in some way, my center. It's this idea of the elegance or the capacity that we have to make architecture. Thank you.